summaries are due October 11th, right? So today's the 8th. So I think, wait a minute, when is the?
It's Thursday.
15th. The 15th.
Well,
So I'm gonna postpone. I'm gonna make this later so that you guys can do it. I'll do it till later 14th at 6 p.m.
turned it.
Huh? Okay, so I'll move that. So I'm gonna do that right now. These two I'm going to be grading if I haven't graded them already. This one got graded and reopened. If Unit 1, if there's any, so several of you, I said this to you guys, several of you had really weird grades. It was like 10.1 or something like that on a grade. I don't know how the hell that happened. Out of 100 on the Unit 1 assignment. So go back to your Brightspace account, see if there's a really low grade that is positive, right? And see if there's a problem with that. Go back, see if you think that you got a 98 and I give you a 10, right? That should be a problem, and you should tell me, and I'm happy to regrade it if I made a mistake, especially for Unit 1. Once again, once we're done with Unit 2, then Unit 1, whatever the grades are in Unit 1 are set, right? And then we'll do the same thing with Unit 2 when we get done with Unit 3. So I'm gonna change this right now, and that's another way to study too. So let me do that. All right, so that is set here. The bone histology, appendicular skeleton lesson, and axial skeleton lesson are all scheduled here. They're all submitted. I also want to show you what I have for your viewing pleasure, again, for your study habits in Unit 2. So my suggestion would be you absolutely can go online and find these terms. There's no question about it. But the question is, are those the same terms that I'm using? So someone might use the term demifacet more often than I use facet, right? If I'm going to be grading it and I'm only looking for facet and you're used to demifacet, right? That's one minor thing. Another thing, a couple years ago, we changed the textbook. It doesn't really matter to you, but what I did was so if you look at this thing, so we have chapter 5, the integument, we talked about that, bone structures, chapter 6, and then if you look at the next 3 slide decks here, the axial, pectoral girdle, and pelvic girdle, they're all chapter 7. So the new textbook, this textbook that we're using now, does that structure in this whole unit in 3 chapters. The old book did it in 4 chapters. Right, now, if you look down here, the axial, chapter 7, and chapter 8 is the axial and the appendicular. This is the old book. So these are slides from the old book. Again, different pictures. It's the same material. It's not, there's nothing changing. If you look at this, Bio 221, AMP1 skeleton, right? Those are the terms that are relevant there, what parts of the bones we're going to ask. I'm not sure why I have all these videos sort of randomly distributed here. I don't know what happened. But there's all these videos that I'm pretty sure that I made them, because then there's also this whole section here of unit, this is bone diagrams and videos. So there's lots and lots of pictures here. Many of these pictures are ones that I'm going to use in my questions. So it's already in Brightspace. If this is the cervical vertebrae, and it is, right, I could just drop this picture into a question, into a Brightspace question, right, and then start labeling it and asking questions about it. So I definitely will use these pictures from here, these JPEGs that are already in Brightspace, but I want to encourage you to do that too, okay? Now, in terms of studying this, you guys should be studying it in short bursts. So when I say short bursts, I say like an hour of really intense studying and then go do something else, right? So what else can you do? Well, let's see. you have other classes, right? You have medical terminology, you have chemistry, you have EMT, you know, other things that you do. So a short burst of 45 minutes to an hour, really, really intense. And if you think of the way that I divided this class here, so I'm about to talk about the pectoral girdle. Right? So study the pectoral girdle for an hour, but really, really intensive. Write down all the terms, every bone in the pectoral girdle. Write down the term, all the stuff that you need to know from the proximal part of the bones of the pectoral girdle. Write all the terms that are distal parts of the bones of the pectoral girdle. You know, questions like that, right? So you should be doing this really intensely, and then you go to something else, and then you go back. And you want to try to mix yourself up as much as you can while you're studying. Because if you mix yourself up while you're studying, and you are actively studying, right? If you look at this list, and you're not actively studying, and you can just say, let's see here. Oh yeah, I know that. Oh yeah, I know that. Oh yeah, I know that. Once again, all you're doing is telling me that you can read. And I think we can all read in this room. So if you can read, then don't do that. So look at the scapula here. So here are the borders, right? The scapula is pretty much a triangle. So draw a triangle. And then say, okay, this is the superior border, here's the medial border, here's the lateral border, right? And then you start adding to it. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be a good drawing. It just has to replicate more or less what your mind's eye will remember about the scapula. So don't just go to this and say, this is what I remember this. Because if you just say you remember it, that's a perfect way of being unhappily surprised on this exam. All right. So once again, we're talking about the pectoral girdle. The first few slides of this section right here, the pectoral girdle, is identical to the previous axial skeleton because it's the same chapter, right? So this stuff right here we won't really talk about. We've already talked about it. The axial and the appendicular skeleton here. Again, pay attention to how I'm dividing the skeletal system because those are bite-sized chunks of information. And if you know everything from pectoral girdle, and then you go to the pelvic girdle and you don't, right? So that gives you an idea of what to remember and what to study. So the pectoral girdle is, here is a picture of Robert Waldwell. He's the tallest man in recorded history. Now, which guy is it? Now, everyone else in this picture are normal sized people. Maybe there's a kid right here that's still growing. Obviously, he had a problem. Now, what problem did he have that caused him to grow this?
Wouldn't it be the epiphyses?
What was controlling the epiphyses?
The
So, does everyone agree that, look at how, this guy's waist is at his father's head. He's like 8 foot, I think he was 8'9".
Didn't he have like giganticism or something?
Yes, he had gigantism, but what's the problem with, so from a bone perspective, from an osseous tissue perspective, what caused those bones to grow too long?
He didn't excreted excess growth hormone.
There's growth hormone that's, we're not going to worry about the hormones themselves, but the hormones, there's too much hormone, and that hormone prevented which part of the bones from ossifying?
The epithelial plate.
The epiphyseal plates to epiphyseal lines, right? If you remember that, right? If you don't ossify, right, then the bone keeps growing. Now, if it's not ossified, what structure is going to be adding to the length of the bones? What material?
What?
Which one?
Wait, what material?
So, what kind of cartilage? Hyaline cartilage, good. What cells are to be making those hyaline cartilage? Chondro what? Come on, say something. Chondroblast, right? If they're in lacunae, they're not chondroblasts, what are they?
Osteo.
No, they're so cartilage, so they're chondrocytes. If they're in lacunae, in osseous tissue, they're what? Osteocytes, right? So now these chondroblasts are adding more tissue either to the superficial portion of the epiphysis on the arm bone or the inferior portion of the epiphysis, the distal portion of the epiphysis on the humerus, right? As a result, it's getting longer and longer, and this is what happens when we don't, when it doesn't stop, right? So it's pretty unhealthy. He ended up having trouble walking because he was so long, so tall. He ended up having trouble feeling things in his feet, and he ended up getting an infection down there and then dying from it. He only lived to be about 28 years old. So this is what happens if things go awry. Once again, different types of bones, right? Bone shapes, all that terminology here. When you're talking about the pelvic girdle or the pectoral girdle here, all we're talking about are these things right here, or these things here, the thigh, the leg, the foot, and really the lower limb also includes the os coxae and the sacrum. The upper limb also includes the clavicle and the sacrum, the scapula. Speaking of the scapula, you have, I think that I put up pictures here. So let me just, yeah, I definitely have pictures later on. So now these pictures, you can, these slides are a lot easier for me to modify. This is from the old textbook, so I really like them. So I have modified them. If you look at the red line, the red text, that text is something that you need to know. So let's just go back here. In terms of the scapula itself, I think that's it. Yeah, the scapula, there's an anterior view and a posterior view. The anterior view is on the left, the posterior view is on the right. Which bone articulates with it medially?
The scapula?
Which bone articulates with the scapula medially?
The vertebra?
Which bone articulates with the scapula medially? Okay, what's another bone on this slide? Okay, so which bone articulates with the scapula medially?
The clavicle.
Clavicle, right? So the clavicle's right here. So what are we talking about here? The scapula goes laterally, right? The scapula's posterior and laterally, and it reaches around, and right about here, it goes medially. There's a medial articulation.
I suppose that's right.
Right, now, which bone articulates with it laterally?
The humerus?
The humerus. Are there any other bones that articulate with the scapula that you can identify? It's simple and yes or no.
Yes.
If there is, what is it?
Which one?
We just identified two bones that articulate with this. That and the humerus. What's this again? The clavicle and the humerus. Is there any other bone that articulates with it? Not that I know of. Now, is it sitting on the radius? Is it sitting on the ribs? Yes, it is. But that is not an articulation, right? It's moving on. So if you go like this and this, my left scapula is moving either anterior and laterally and posterior and medially, right? It's moving there, but it's not articulating with it. It's sliding on top of it, right? In terms of the scapula itself, there's the anterior view, anterior, posterior. If you see that spine of the scapula, I was asked last week or 2 weeks ago, you're grabbing the spine of the scapula, that's the posterior view. Above the scapula spine, below the scapular spine, those are fossa. There's this anterior surface right here is the subscapular fossa. This posterior surface, there's a supraspinous fossa, infraspinous fossa. Those fossa are points of
they're not points of attachment, but there's points of location for muscles. The acromion process is a major point of articulation, and that's right there. I want to make sure I get it right. And what bone articulates with the acromion process?
The humerus.
Not, well, yeah, sort of. What's another bone that, not named the humerus, what's another bone that articulates at the acromion process? The clavicle. There is a joint called the AC joint right here, called the acromioclavicular joint. And that acromion process projects anterior and is furthest laterally, right? That acromion process, if you project posteriorly, runs seamlessly with the scapular spine. And that's how you can identify that. The other process that is anterior and a little bit inferior to the acromion process is the coracoid process. That coracoid process is point of attachment for muscles and also for ligaments, and they forming together with those two processes, they form some ligaments and they form the glenoid cavity. That glenoid cavity is where the humerus articulates. I said that the scapula itself is triangular here. The most obvious border is right here, the medial border. If that's the medial border and this is lateral here, there's the lateral border, and notice the lateral border is also called the axillary border. This term axillary means arm or near to the arm, and that's a question from quiz 2. There's a superior border, and then there's angles, and those angles are where the two lines meet in the triangle. There's an inferior angle, superior angle. Of those two, the inferior angle is really the most obvious one. If you take this picture, and you certainly can, take a screenshot, scribble out everything on this picture, and then take 2 screenshots. Leave original, take a screenshot, and scribble out everything on there. You have the perfect study guide, right? Posterior view of the scapula. By the way, what side of the body is this from?
Right.
Are you sure?
Yes.
How do you know?
Because that's the spine and the scapula. And it's on the
Yeah,
posterior
so this is the
side.
spine of the
That's
scapula.
on the posterior side.
So this is a posterior view of the scapula, and so that's right. So it says posterior. What does it say? You see down here on the bottom? I'm trying to trick you?
Yeah,
Are you sure?
Absolutely. You want me to trick you now?
that's what you did in the wrong.
Yes, I just did it to you because I don't like you. I didn't do it to anyone else in this room,
So
right?
disappointing.
Right? I didn't do it to anyone else in this room.
I'm completely aware.
Now, if you look at this diagram here, you see these are the this skeletal right here. See these 2 bones? These are 2 bones of the scapula. See how this big arrow right here? This is the right side, this is the left side. So if you look right here, so this is definitely the right side of the scapula.
Wait, so what was the trick?
I don't know, she said it was
It is
tricky.
the right side.
It is the right side. Just because I don't say that you're right immediately, doesn't mean that you're not right, that you're
He's
wrong.
like, are you sure?
Yes.
Oh, he said that he does that.
I do it to everyone.
No, yeah, I know.
Anterior view of the scapula, there's less to talk about in the anterior view, right? So if the big subscapular fossa, right there is the most obvious point, sort of identifying feature of that. If you look where my pointer is, right there, there's a cavity, and it's hard to identify a cavity because it's a space. So if you ever see something like that, what is that space? That's the glenoid cavity. And underneath there, it says also the lateral angle. Right? So that's sort of, could be confusing. The clavicle, I won't ask you to try to identify which end is which, but I can ask what bone articulates medially, what bone articulates laterally, where on the thoracic cavity is it, what is superior to, what's inferior to, right? I can ask questions like that. Right? But I won't ask about the sternal end versus the acromial end to identify them, to say that this is the acromial versus the sternal end. I might say what bone is this and what possible end structure could I be pointing to, right? And then I could give you a couple of different choices, one of which would be the sternal end. Right? But I won't ask you to distinguish between the two. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, this is another slide from the old lecture notes. Which process articulates with the acromial end of the clavicle? The coracoid, the tubercle, the trochanter. Does your scapula have a trochanter or tubercle? Nope. The acromial end. The acromion process articulates with the clavicle. Here, right there, where my pointer is, the AC joint, the acromioclavicular joint. So now, is where I'm pointing to right there on the clavicle, what end of the clavicle am I pointing to? The acromial end, right? And then this is the sternal end. The humerus, I didn't ask a lot of distal questions about the humerus when you get to the elbow, and there's a lot there. So we're gonna get to that in a minute. But first of all here, you should recognize that, first of all, this is the humerus. You should know which is medial and which is lateral. So my pointer on this middle drawing, is that medial and proximal or lateral and proximal? So it has to be medial because that's the head of the humerus and that always projects medially. So if that's medial and this is proximal, then this is distal. If that is medial, and it is, then I'm pointing right there to the medial epicondyle. So you look at the bone right here, or the head of the humerus, and you go down, you stay on the same side of the head of the humerus, and that's always medial. And then the other side is lateral. Now, if we're standing in anatomical position, and I am, we're standing in anatomical position, so this is medial, that's lateral, which portion of the humerus, medial or lateral, articulates with the distal arm? Which bone does the lateral humerus articulate with, the radius or the ulna? So the lateral humerus articulates with the radius, the medial humerus articulates with the ulna. Okay, so that's the medial portion right here, the lateral portion right there. So this part right here would be where the radius is, and this part right there is where the ulna is, okay? And then, now, is this an anterior view or a posterior view? It's not really clear, right? You can't really see if you can see a very, very deep fossa, that's called the olecranon fossa, and that's found on the ulna, and we said that the ulna is articulating medially, so that's good, right? If we say that, so this is where the ulna is, right? Then laterally here, the radius articulates, I'm gonna tell you, it articulates with the capitulum. So the capitulum is this rounded surface right there, and what it does is it allows us to do this. Right? So that head of the humerus can rotate. We'll talk about that term, what that rotation does later on in the semester. So let's start at the top there, or proximally. So there's the head, obvious head of the humerus here. I don't distinguish between the surgical and the anatomical neck. I just sort of call that the neck. There are tubercles, and tubercles are prominences on the proximal portion of it. There's a big one and a little one with an intervening indentation. That intervening indentation is the intertubercular groove or intertubercular sulcus. Either one, they're both the same. There's a greater tubercle and a lesser tubercle. And then laterally, and again, I'm close to the head, but laterally is the deltoid tuberosity. A tuberosity is a roughened area of the muscle of the bone for a point of attachment for a muscle. Guess what muscle attaches at the deltoid tuberosity? Guess what muscle attaches at the deltoid tuberosity?
Unplugged itself.
The what? The deltoid.
Yeah, it was
Right?
rolling on.
So that if you're standing like this, and and I'm raised my right hand like that, right? That's actually a particular movement, but the movement is principally done by the deltoid. It's pulling on the deltoid tuberosity, and it's pulling evenly from anterior to posterior portion of the deltoid. So now, if I go like this, I'm moving evenly. If I go like this, I'm moving a little bit of the deltoid, but I'm using more of the anterior deltoid than then the posterior deltoid, and then I can move that way, right? Now I'm using more of the posterior deltoid than the anterior deltoid. But regardless, here we're pulling on the deltoid tuberosity, either in the front of it, the back of it, and that's the end. Hi. And I always like people that they're actually paying attention and sort of moving with me, right? So that's the deltoid tuberosity. Another thing I can ask, I can just list all these terms. Where on the bone is it? Which of the following are found proximally? Which of the following are found distally? Right? So that I wouldn't say that the deltoid tuberosity is proximally distally, right? Now, obviously, the tubercles, the head and the neck are all proximally. The capitulum, trochleum, the fossa, and the epicondyles are found distally. So this part right here is part of the elbow. Okay. As I said just a while ago, just a minute ago, the capitulum is articulating with the radius. And I've always had trouble between the capitulum and the trochlea, so I just decided to myself, I'm gonna forget about the trochlea, and I'm only gonna focus on the capitulum. The capitulum allows the radius to rotate. The C and R, capitulum allows the radius to rotate, capitulum allows the radius to rotate. So now, I also know the trochlea is part of the elbow too. So what's the trochlea do? I don't know, but it doesn't do the radius. So what does it do? It has to do the ulna. Look at that. The trochlea has to do the ulna. Okay? So once again, what I'm trying to do here is to say, identify generally where that stuff is, and then pick some of the things that you absolutely know with certainty. And then the other stuff you can say, well, wait a minute here, if it has to be this, it can't be that, so it has to be this. Okay, so I'm trying to get you to identify things and make less memorization here. More pictures, anterior, posterior view here. On the left-hand side, it's an anterior view. On the right-hand side, it's a posterior view. What side of the body is this from?
The right.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Now, if you look at where my pointer is, right here, you can see this deltoid tuberosity is sort of on the diaphysis of the bone. Is this a view? If this is the right, the head is going that way, and my right head of my humerus is going this way, so the heads are wrong.
So it pulls up to the left? What are you saying?
So now, if I go like this, the head of the humerus is going medially, right? The head of the humerus has to go medially. What?
That's the posterior.
How do you know?
So,
It says posterior. So is this, am I giving you I'm trying to mix you up, see? Is this the right view? No. This is the right view. This is the correct view, not the right view, this is the correct view. So this right here is the olecranon fossa. The olecranon fossa is covered up by the olecranon process, right there. There is the lateral epicondyle, the medial epicondyle, lateral epicondyle. Have you ever hit your funny bone? Where you smash it, you got that shooting pain right there. There is a nerve called the ulnar nerve. We'll learn later on, and it is on the medial. It runs right about there, and you smash it, it's exposed a little bit, and then that shooting pain comes up. So once again, if I ask a question like this, what side of the body is this from? That's absolutely possible, but you have to be able to recognize, the easiest place to recognize the anterior versus posterior is the distal portion of the humerus. The greater tubercle is, now this is the anterior view here. So the greater tubercle is lateral, the lesser tubercle is medial, and then what's in between? The intertrabecular sulcus. If you ever had stuff like this, like if you're doing exercises and your joints and you feel like something popping every once in a while, you have ligaments, and then there's these things that cover the ligaments that basically try to keep the ligaments in these grooves, and if it pops out of the groove, sometimes you'll hear that snap right there. What are you doing? Oh, all right. Yes. Oh. What? Science behind a Charlie horse. the science behind the Charlie horse. Well, first of all, let's see. Want to feel a Charlie horse? So, so it's science behind the Charlie horse. So we're getting a little bit off target here, but that's a function of the muscle, right? So, if my little brother is here, I punch him, give him a happy birthday punch, right? And then he beat me up because he's a lot bigger than me. But if he got a Charlie horse from me, right? I hit him in the leg. The muscle right here is responding to that.
I thought it was in your calf.
So that's a cramp, right? Right? So that I always say Charlie horse is when you punch someone and you get a big bruise. Right? What do you call Charlie horse? The cramp. So it could be a cramp, right? So if it's a cramp in your calf, so that's from. Remember we talked about mitochondria producing ATP, right? Some muscles like calf muscles run out of ATP really quickly, and because there's not enough oxygen there, and if they run out of ATP and they're still flexing, then you got to go into anaerobic respiration, and if you go to anaerobic respiration too long, your muscles start to cramp up. Basically, the proteins don't slide anymore, because normally the proteins got to go like this and slide, but then when they start grabbing after the cramp and they don't let go, that's when there's too much. There's not enough oxygen in the muscle.
You can see it in that.
Anterior and posterior view of the humerus. The humeroradial articulation. How many bones are in this drawing right here, or in this picture, or this picture? There's 3. If you see this picture right here, you should be able to tell me what side of the body is it from, or what side of the body this is from. In both cases, it's the right side. Right? This is a posterior view on the right side. This is an anterior view. I said that the capitulum and the radius go together. So if the capitulum and the radius go together, that's right here. So if it's not the capitulum, then it's over here, and that's the trochlea. So there's the trochlea. The trochlea is associated with the medial epicondyle. The capitulum is associated with the lateral epicondyle, although it's not labeled right there. The capitulum articulates with the head of the radius. The coronoid process is a small process that's anterior on the ulna. The coronoid process articulates with the trochlea. And then posteriorly, if we go over here, again, now we see this big production right here, process rather, this medial epicondyle. Here is the olecranon, or the olecranon process. That olecranon process gives, and the combination of the olecranon process and the coronoid process in the ulna gives you that U shape where you can identify the ulna. The olecranon process articulates, or is found residing within the olecranon fossa, so those two things go together. And that fossa is that major indentation. So if you're looking at this picture right here, if you see the fossa and you see this major projection right there, this is always medial and this is posterior. And if you have those two things and you know this is distal, right, you should be able to identify that this is the right side of the body. Most bones only have one point of articulation. They touch, so the humerus and the scapula, right? They have one point of articulation at the head. Down here, you don't touch the scapula, right? That doesn't happen. Most of the time that's happened, except in 2 instances. The radius and ulna is one instance, and talk tomorrow about the tibia and the fibula in a second instance. So as a result, you have to be clear as to what articulation you're talking about. There's a proximal radio-ulnar articulation and a distal radio-ulnar articulation. That distal radio-ulnar articulation is not by the elbow, it's by the wrist. The proximal one is by the elbow. Distal from the proximal radio-ulnar articulation on the radius is another tuberosity, and that tuberosity is called a radial tuberosity. That radial tuberosity is lateral, but proximal on the radius, and it's a point of attachment for flexors of the forearm flexors, or that are found on basically your biceps. The radius has the head and the neck,
and that head is that rounded portion that articulates with the capitulum of the humerus. The head is the one that allows the radius to rotate. And then distally here, we have the styloid process and then the notch for the ulnar head called the ulnar notch. So there's the proximal and the distal radial ulnar articulation. In this case, we're talking just about the radius. But if you look up here, where my pointer is in 1 second, in the diagram here, I'm sorry, in the actual pictures of the bones, this is the proximal radial ulnar articulation, and that's the distal radial ulnar articulation. Radial ulnar articulation. We talked about the radius here, so now we'll talk a little bit about the ulnar. The trochlea is a portion of the humerus that articulates with the radius, so there's a trochlear notch on the ulna. There's a coronoid process, this is anterior. There's a olecranon process that's posterior. The combination of those two processes I just said a second ago make that U. And then the radial notch is proximally on the ulna, and the radial notch found on the ulna is articulating with the radial head, the head of the radius. And that's formed the proximal radial ulnar articulation. The ulna also has a head, and that's distal, and that head articulates with the radius, and it also articulates with some carpals. We'll talk about those in a second. And then finally, both the radius and the ulna have a styloid process, but you need to distinguish between them. So now we have a styloid process on the temporal bone, a styloid process on the radius, and a styloid process on the ulna. More pictures. Radial tuberosity here, the proximal radial ulnar joint, the distal radial ulnar joint, and here the head of the ulna, the styloid process of the radius. And then the proximal view of the elbow there, or proximal portion of the radius and the ulna. The final thing is the membrane that occurs between these two bones that are largely parallel, and that's called an interosseous membrane, a membrane between two bones, and that interosseous membrane keeps some bones together. And when I was a kid, I broke my arm twice, and I didn't go to physical therapy. Physical therapy wasn't a thing. So now, as a result, you know, my left arm was broken both times, and I can do this, and I can do this pretty easily with my right hand, and I'm not kidding you, I can't do this anymore. So this movement right here, I can move it a little bit more, but it is limited. So what happened here is that interosseous membrane got affected here. I broke my arm right back here, and then down here distally on the left arm. And so as a result, that interosseous membrane is much tighter on my left arm than my right. But that interosseous membrane is present here, and again, it's meant to keep those bones parallel. And then the tibia and the fibula as well. There's another interosseous membrane there. You might expect which one is stronger. The interosseous membrane leg is much stronger. Anterior view, posterior view. Here is the label for the proximal radial ulnar joint. Now, if you look at this picture right here, you can see a notch. And so here is the coronoid process. Here is the olecranon process. There's that U-shaped process right there. Right? If you see that notch right there, then that has to be lateral. If that's lateral, what side of the body is this from?
The right.
It's the right side. So if it was so if we're talking about the anterior, so this is anterior, this is posterior, proximal, distal, and this is lateral. So if this is lateral here, this has to be the right side. So it would be this bone right here. We're looking at it from this perspective. Someone stand up and do this. No. But these are, I've often thought about, I'm playing bodybuilders to like, get up and you show them points of things, but this is basically what we're doing there. What are some of the things that we've talked about there? All right, so now the final topic, and I went very easy on you on the hand in the mini practical. All right, now we're going to elevate the terminology greatly. So there's not only are there carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges right here, now we're going to start identifying and labeling them. So first of all, the carpals here have 8 bones, and they come in 2 varieties here. There's proximal carpals and distal carpals. There's 4 carpals that are proximal, 4 carpals that are distal. There's 5 metacarpals, and then there's phalanges that come in 2 different varieties. There's one with 3 ones, and then there's one with 2, the polyps. Carpals, there's a number of different ways that you can remember it. One is straight line of the pinky, here comes the thumb, that's the scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, I'm reading it right now. Hamate, capitate, trapezoid, and trapezium. A couple years ago, I screwed it all up. I don't want to screw it up for you, right? So that is now, so how do you divide it here? This first 4, scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, and pisiform are proximal. Hamate, capitate, trapezoid, and trapezium are distal. So if they're distal, then what bones do they articulate with? What do the distal carpals articulate with distally? What? Don't say phalanges. What is my pointer pointing to?
Metacarpals.
The metacarpals, because what we're talking about here is we're right here at the wrist, and now we're talking distally from there. So that the wrist is right here where this bend is, right here. Now we're talking about wrist, the distal from there. What bone or bones articulates with the proximal carpals? Besides that are non-carpal. What non-carpal bones articulate with the proximal carpals? Which one? So non-carpal bones that articulate with the proximal carpals. So that first 4, the scaphoid, the lunate, triquetrum, and pisiform. What non-carpal bones articulate with the proximal carpals? These 2, radius and the ulna. Right? So the only other, so if you're right here and you go distal from there, that's this way, and distal from here from the proximal carpals is the next layer of carpals. So that I just removed that with the question. So proximally here, the radius and the ulna. The next thing you have to know is that you have to know which of these, you have to know the names, you have to know which are in proximal group and which are distal, and you also have to know medial and lateral. I'll tell you in a minute here that pisiform bone right there is a proximal bone that's medial, and it's associated with the pinky. So the pisiform and the pinky go together, and if you have a bump on your if you pull your hand back like this, you have a little bump that's associated with the ulna. That's not the ulna, that's your pisiform bone. One thing that is really difficult to identify and sort of distinguish here is if I would ask you to identify individual carpal bones with drawings. Okay, so I should be able to ask you in a practical, but we weren't there at that point. So I won't be asking you about identifying names of the carpal bones, like which carpal is this and which carpal is that, but I will be asking you about the names themselves. If you look at this point right here, the proximal row, I said a proximal row is the pisiform bone, and that is standing medial, and that's associated with the pisiform, and that one right there is the pinky. So the pisiform and the pinky go together. So if the pisiform and the pinky go together, then the other side, right here, is the scaphoid and the thumb go together. Okay, and so these are the proximal bones. These are the distal bones. The bones aren't oriented in a perfect plane, so it's hard to see from one perspective or another. So that if you see an anterior view versus a posterior view, so this is the palm of the hand, this is the back of the hand. So how would I ask you about that? Well, if you look at this, the way that I diagram this. We have the 8 bones here. Medially, this is the proximal row, this is the distal row, the medial and lateral here. So now what bone goes here? Well, we have the ulna and the styloid process. Okay, so the ulna and the styloid process goes right there. Then from the ulna and the styloid process, so you go distally at the pisiform, and go distally from there, it's the hamate. And if you go distally from there, it's the metacarpals. Okay? Conversely, you're talking about at the radius here in the radiostyloid process. So now there's that bump right there. We go distally from there, the scaphoid, distally from there, the trapezium, and from there we go to the pollex, or not to the pollex, to the metacarpal number 1. Okay, we haven't gotten to the carpal. So this is metacarpal number 1. This is metacarpal number 5, and you can see that these carpals don't match up perfectly with the metacarpals, so that's a little bit confusing. Proximal row versus distal row, medial versus lateral. Okay? Questions about that? I won't ask you to identify individual bones. I might say to you, which of the following could this be for a carpal? And then, you know, I could list metacarpals, I could put other bones in there, and then ask you basically identify which one of these bones is a carpal, okay, in the names. Right, so that's the only thing that but I won't ask you to identify which carpal is this, which carpal is that. Again, now, the next thing is talking about the metacarpals here. Metacarpals are numbered 1 through 5 here. The lateral metacarpal is associated with the radius. The lateral metacarpal is number 1. The medial metacarpal is associated with the ulna and the pisiform. The medial metacarpal is number 5. These medial metacarpals here, these carpals themselves have 2 articulations here. They articulate with the distal carpals, and they articulate with the proximal phalanges. So these proximal phalanges there's a metacarpal phalange joint, and there's a metacarpal or a carpal metacarpal joint right here. And where my pointer is right there is this point right here on if you make a fist and you have little bumps right there, those little bumps are where my pointer is right there. Okay, so that would be, so if we're talking about this in the anterior view, here is the thumb or the pollex right here. So the anterior view is this way. So this point right there is where my pointer is right there. That's metacarpal number 2, metacarpal number 2, and this is down here. This is the metacarpal phalange joint. And then the phalanges come in 2 or 3 varieties, and you know my favorite phalange. There's 2 or 3 phalanges. There's the proximal and distal phalange on the pollex, the proximal and distal here, and the proximal, middle, and distal phalange in the other phalanges. Oopsie. So phalanges are numbered the same way as the metacarpals here. And for the final time, boom. All right?
Oh my.
What? Do you got me on video doing that?
Maybe.
What? It's just flange number. What flange number is this?
3.
3. Okay. So, and then there's the proximal, middle, and distal flange. I'm not saying it to you.
It's just anatomy.
Right, it's just anatomy. All right. So I went through a lot of stuff today. Hopefully, someone mentioned yesterday. Someone said, oh, hey, this sounds really familiar.
Oh.
I hope this is familiar. I hope I'm not boring you too much. I hope I identified the stuff that you're already familiar with, and then I'm extending it, especially like today with the scapula, today with the elbow, the carpal radial, the radial ulnar joints here, the carpal metacarpal joint, right, the additional carpals, right? So those are things, if that stuff's new, you should study that now.
I suppose
I suppose.
Are there any questions for me?
What the heck happened?
What's that?
Oh, we leave it?
No?
Thank you. You're welcome.